We're going to call on New York City very shortly and speak to one of New York City's most famous residents. There are a few, I suppose, but few don't match this man's name. And he's at the end of the line right now. Gabby the Cabby. How are you, Gabby?
I am just fine, live from the rather empty and quiet streets of New York.
Yeah, it certainly is. And you just to describe, how would I describe you? I suppose as a man who likes to zoom around New York in his yellow cab, better known as a, better known
Yellow.
as a, go on.
Well, I call it a yellow, I think is what you're searching for, a yellow mobile conveyance lounge. But for the first time in my life, if I were to go out and drive it today, I could zoom around. Normally, you have tremendous traffic. The average traffic in New York City usually goes about 20 miles an hour. I usually say if I want to run somebody over, I got to get out of the cab to do it. But on days like this, there's nobody on the streets. It's empty and quiet.
Well, sometimes I suppose in the years that anyone's living in a big city, sometimes they would say, well, it's nice to have it quiet once in a while, but when you rely on those streets for your living, it's not such a good idea. Mind you, they did a thing the other day, as I've often said, there's the downside to this, and there's an upside to it. The upside is the environment is cleaning, and there's no wars, etc., etc. But they did a survey, not a survey, how would you call it in Oxford Street? They did to do a counter, some sort of counter to see what's the environment like there, X fumes, car fumes, and it was a 80% improvement. So I suppose the environment in New York, do you notice any difference?
Yeah, well, no, there is a difference in it. It's a difference in the type of noise. In other words, New York is usually a collection of noises. It's almost like a hum. You're hearing noises from every places. Whereas now the noise you hear is very isolated because it's one police car, one ambulance, one truck, one bus. So instead of hearing this big symphony of noise, you hear the isolated noise and you get time to almost appreciate it in a way. If we weren't all starving to death, it would be kind of nice, come to think of it. Not to mention, of course, of all the dead people.
Of course. Gabby, just let's find out more about you. Better known as Gabby the Cabby, Gabby the Cabby, but also better known as Peter Franklin. Peter, it's great to have you on the line. Tell us a little bit about you. You're a yellow cab driver in New York. How long have you been driving a cab?
Oh, I've been driving a cab, I'll bet you about 30 years. I mean, I've been in it a long time. I also give tours to people of the city. So I really am what you would call as a professional driver. I know the city like the back of my hand. I think I could say that I'm one of the world's leading authorities on all the interesting information and the trivia about New York City. So I know it well. And I like to classify myself as a streetwise person who knows what's going on. I know the story. I know the deal. I know the difference between a straight shooter and a con man.
Talking about shooters, I mean, obviously there's very little crime happening now in New York. That's another upside compared to what it was like only a few weeks ago. I would assume I'm right in saying.
No, not exactly. If anything, the crime in New York City has been very minimal for quite some time now because we have terrific law enforcement. And there's always people on the streets, so you don't run into those situations where the streets are deserted. Now it's a different story. About 20% of the cops have called in sick, so they're not even showing up to work. The other 80% are not really doing it with their heart in it. They're not looking to arrest somebody and put handcuffs on somebody. So actually, crime has gone up quite a bit. But what's also gone up quite a bit is domestic violence. This thing about keeping people locked in their houses must be driving everybody crazy. So no, these are very troublesome times. Once upon a time, I would have said to you, Morris, that, you want to go for a stroll. It's 9:30, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Let's go out on the streets. Let's walk along Fifth Avenue. Nothing to give it a second thought. Now, I'd be on my guard walking on the streets of New York once it becomes dark.
Is it because that you think that some of the people are now desperate, that they don't have an income, they need money? Some of them are in a genuine situation, one could say, genuine as crime can be, but they're trying to feed their family and they just turn to desperation and turn on guys that have a few bob in their pocket.
Well, some of that is true, and some of that comes from a Charles Dickens novel where it's the poor guy who's stealing to save his family. But no, these are criminals who are around all the time, except they can't work under normal circumstances. This is like a paradise for them. So they do work at this time. They're the creatures of the night that the world's population has had for years and years and years. So no, crime has become a problem, and I think it's going to become severe. As far as not having money for food, New York City is kind of unique. First of all, every single person in New York City has received $1,200 from the federal government. In addition to that, New York has set up a system now that you and I can walk over to the nearest school and get 3 meals a day. We don't have to show any identification. We don't have to show any need. If we just walk in the door and say we're hungry, we get a meal. So New York is kind of taking care of its own pretty well when it comes to somebody starving to death. Medical care, well, going into this thing, we had a big, tremendous medical system, which has been able to handle it quite well. So I'd rather be in New York City for this type of thing than Cheyenne, Wyoming, I'll tell you that.
Well, this morning I was listening to the news. On the line is Gabby the Cabby, a man who's famous for his yellow cab in New York and other places in the world. He's taken it on tour, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I heard in the news this morning, very distressingly, is that New York have got something in the region of 250,000, quarter of a million people in hospital with the coronavirus. That's a very, very high figures and still rising.
Well, you got to remember it's a very congested place. I mean, we got normally in the 5 boroughs, 8.5 million people. In the greater New York City area, we got 30 million people. So when you have all these people who are squashed together, many of whom are wise guys who aren't wearing their masks, who aren't keeping their distance, they thought they were going to beat the rap. Well, they didn't, because that's why our death rate is so high, and that's why the hospitals are packed to the gills. But it's sort of like a civil disobedience. You figure the disease is not going to get me, so why should I wear a mask? Whoops, what a mistake.
What a mistake. One thing or a couple of these we might have in common, sort of good looks and young age, but also what we have in common is we bring our clients in our car, and it fears, things have changed here, will change, I assume, when real estate gets back into full swing. At the moment, we will not be taking clients in the car, but they will meet us at the property and we'll keep our distance. You don't have that choice, Gabby. Do you have, like a London cab, do you have any plastic or some sort of shield between you and the passenger?
Yeah, it is, but it's meaningless. For all intents and purposes, real estate market in New York City is absolutely 100% dead. Some of the real estate companies and real estate people are going through the motions. They're saying that they're going to take you out to show you the apartments, or they'll do it online, using the computer and all that. But this is not a period of time when anybody's considering buying a house or renting an apartment. So it's a pretty dead market. You'd be able to sit here and play pinochle with me all day.
Funny. I'm with Bromley Estates. We're one of the biggest employers, certainly here in this part of Spain. And since lockdown, we've had phenomenal amount of inquiries coming in. In fact, we've had one or two actual sales subject to viewing. So it's probably a different market. You're a residential market. We're sort of more tourist market, that people want to own second homes. And some people who are retired and they want to get out of the countries are into some good weather down here. So it might be a different scenario. But the question I asked you is, what sort of protection are you going to, will you put up a divide between you and the yellow? I don't think.
Well, there is a divide that presumably is put there to save me from getting robbed, which is kind of silly because, the guy is going to say, stick him up. And what am I going to say? Ha ha, I got a 1/4 inch of plexiglass. You can't hurt me. No. And plus the fact he can always walk around to the driver's side and point the gun through the window. No, the solution, as far as that goes, that's a waste of time. But I'm not driving anyway, so I don't have that worry.
No, but I'm talking about when I go back to work, I assume that things will look different. I mean, I haven't been out. I don't know if you've been out, but many of my younger friends have been out. My sons have certainly been out, but they explained to me the supermarkets are very respectful. They keep their distance. People, they're all wearing masks. In fact, I went to pick up, just outside where I am, just at the gate, to pick up from an Amazon driver a package that I'd ordered, and he was there and he had his mask on. And it's getting to the point where we probably accept people wearing masks as a sort of way of life for the moment, anyway.
Yeah, well, because of course it was once upon a time you wouldn't walk into a bank with a mask on your face.
No,
Now
no,
you
no,
don't
no.
walk into
Yeah,
the bank without the mask on your face. And
yeah.
what's happening is that New Yorkers are discovering something interesting. You know, one of the arts and wonderful things about living in New York, if you want something, you walk out your apartment, you take an elevator down to the main floor, and there's a store right in your building. So you go and get whatever you want, a cup of coffee, a container of milk, or what have you. Now people are using the online services, and you're having places like Amazon delivering packages and things. As a matter of fact, yesterday, President Trump made the observation when somebody raised the issue about the post office delivering packages for Amazon. He said that Amazon has basically been screwing the post office by not paying enough money for the delivery, and he wants the post office to increase its rates to Amazon by 4 times. I'm sure Amazon is having a heart attack over that.
Yeah, well, there are a few companies, suppose, making a lot of money out of this. I'm not saying, yeah, very few, but one of them has to be Netflix, and the other one has to be Amazon, because people can't go out shopping and online shopping. And I'm not talking about fashion, I'm talking about food and necessities. So they all seem to be doing quite well. I have a client, for example, who's in the beef business, and he's never been busier simply because he's supplying supermarkets, and demand for home cooking with no restaurants open has quadrupled, I suppose.
A
So
big a big thing is that a lot of people are doing cooking in the apartment.
sure.
And I have firsthand knowledge of that because my wife has a website for gluten intolerant people. She doesn't sell anything. She just gives suggestions on the way to make foods and something. And the number of hits, I guess that's what you call it, of people going to her website to find out how to cook gluten free has just jumped up phenomenally. The website, I might do a commercial, although
Well,
she's not
absolutely
selling
do it.
anything, is Mrs. Gabby's Kitchen.
Mrs. Gabby, making a note of it here. Mrs. Gabby's Kitchen. I certainly will pass it on to
And
my
if
wife
anybody
because,
has a gluten intolerance, please feel free to contact her and ask questions. And as I say, she's not selling anything, so no salesman will call.
okay, no problem. My wife she likes gluten free or is involved there, and I think she'd be delighted to get on, and I hope my listeners will as well. Just get back to the cab and the driving a yellow cab in New York. Tell us some of the stories there. Have you ever been held up? Have you ever had any crime in your cab over the 30 odd years?
No, you see that you're required by law to pick up the yellow cabs you hail on the streets. The other kind of cabs, you do that via computer and online. So we're in a different situation. And of course, the law says that if somebody hails me on the street, I must pick them up. And of course, that's not true in real thoughts. Cab drivers are very careful about who they pick up. What people like to do is they always blame it that the cab driver is discriminating because of color. That's nonsense. Cab drivers don't pick you up because they just don't like the way you look. So they go by you and they ignore you. And that's the truth and the reality of it. So that's what you have to do. You have to be very careful who you pick up. Obviously, if I see two guys standing with an Uzi on the street corner, I don't pick
Yeah,
them up.
yeah, I'm sure you don't. Tell me, Uber, do you have that there in New York?
Yeah, no, there is. They're not doing that well. There's been a lot of problems with them. New Yorkers are just like New Yorkers were used to walking out the door and going downstairs and buying a container of milk. New Yorkers are very used to walking out the door and just waving their arm and getting a yellow cab. Uber, you have to go through a fairly complex procedure of using the software, making an appointment, meet the guy at a certain spot, and what have you. So it's a little bit of a different story. They haven't been much of a problem in New York. And as a matter of fact, they too are all starving to death now because there's no business for them either.
How many yellow cabs are there? Do you know the
Yes, I
numbers?
do. There's about 13,000 yellow cab vehicles and about 50,000 people who are licensed. You need a special license to drive them. And normally, a cab driver who works his head off during the week will make about a New York City yellow cab driver will
Hmm.
make about $2,000 a week.
Wow. Wow. But you have expense. I mean, your expenses obviously are your gas, your petrol. Do you get a special discount on that?
Well, not really in a sense, because what you happen is that, for instance, I have a taxi license, so I can drive a yellow cab. So what I can do is I can go to any one of the 13 garages that has cabs, and I lease that cab for the day for $125, and all the money I make past that is mine to keep. Plus, when I return the cab at the end of the day, it has to be filled with gasoline. So it's a pretty much of a Peter Pan wanderlust experience. There's not too much involved. If something goes wrong with the cab, it's fixed by the garage. So you can start off the day without a penny in your pocket because the guy you're getting the cab from knows you, and he says, give me money at the end of the day.
So I could turn up, know nothing about New York. Um, Not unlike England, you don't have the knowledge there. I mean, you don't have to go through huge amount of exams to
Nah,
get
that's old English baloney. I mean, my attitude towards that is that's like serfdom. That's the way they con these younger people into doing 2 years of slavery work. We don't have that in New York City.
But yet, obviously, I could come in then with a locator in my car, with a locator in my pocket, knock at the door, say I want to rent one of those, give them $100, and I'm away.
Yeah, exactly. It's a much, and especially now that we have the GPS. Remember when I started out, you really had to know the
Sure.
city. I still know the city like the back of my hand. For instance, if I drop you off, I know where to go next to get my next fare. I know in your area where I just dropped you off at your house, there's a little hotel down the road, and I know if I wheeze by there, I'll get a fare. So you still need a lot of streetwise knowledge. But the most fascinating thing about driving, and the part I've loved the most, is you're eavesdropping on people's conversation. And in this day and age, everybody goes under the assumption that the cab driver doesn't speak English.
Mhm.
So I get a great deal of pleasure of sitting in the front seat, listening to the people
Oh, I
who are
say.
talking and talking and talking.
Yeah,
For
if
instance,
you,
nothing is
yeah.
better than two ladies talking about sex, because by the end of that conversation, I feel I need a cigarette.
Talking about that, I asked you if you ever had a gunman or some violence in your cab, but you said you haven't. But have you ever had like one of those romantic films, a little lady
No,
in the car?
it's called a barter ride, where
Yeah.
you'll actually have some woman who'll say, "Can she work off
Have
the
you have you
work off the
experienced
fare?"
that, Peter? Have
Yes,
you?
yes, because I'm a good-looking, sophisticated, urban
Well, of
charming guy.
course we know that
I wouldn't
exactly.
touch it with a 10-foot pole because I don't want to die from something.
I
And
try.
most of the fact, I love my wife. But no, it happens occasionally. But I can tell you, do we have time to hear about my best sex in the
Okay,
cab story?
of course we have time, Peter.
I picked up this elderly couple who were grandparents who lived in Florida, and I picked them up at Penn Station. And they were going north to a place called New Rochelle, which is one of our suburbs. And as the guy got in the cab with me and helped his wife into the cab, he said, "Would I mind if they had sex in the cab on the way up there?" I said, "What, are you kidding me?" He said, "No, it's sort of one of their lifetime dreams to have sex in the cab." I said, "Well, if you want to, you can do it." Sure enough, I start driving up the highway heading to New Rochelle, which is going to take about 30 minutes to their granddaughter's house. And they're doing it. They're doing it in the back of the cab. I can't believe my eyes.
Did you look
As a
in the
matter of
mirror?
fact, I had the rear view mirror. I had to stop. Well, I had to stop looking at the rear view mirror. We figured we'd end up on the sidewalk. So we get up there, and they're all finished and everything, and they get out, and the grandchildren come and greet them, and blah blah blah, and everything. Well, I thought it was such a fantastic story. I said to the guy, I talk to radio stations all over the world. I said, "Do you mind if I tell them to call you to tell the story?" He said, "No, I didn't care at all." So at that time, and I don't know whether or not we were talking, I gave out his phone number in Florida with his permission, and broadcasters were calling him to ask him to discuss how he enjoyed having sex with his wife. And it was really kind of nice because they'd been
Sure.
married for like 40 years,
Oh
and it
my
was like
God.
a decent kind of thing. There was nothing pornographic about it. So I'll look around and see if I can find his number, and I'll give it to you.
That would be cool. I mean, 40 years. I thought you were talking about a young couple. I was on a train once going up to Madrid, and a young couple. I say young couple. They were in their 20s or 30s, and they took a blanket with them. And for some reason, they decided to have sex on the train. Now, it's not that long a journey, and I just wonder if it's now. I think about it. Maybe it's part of the bucket list. When I said bucket list with a B, by the way, just the way maybe I don't know. Maybe some people have some weird ambitions in life. Mine has never been to have sex in a cab, I must say, but maybe it'll make its way
Nah,
onto
it's
my bucket
uncomfortable.
list.
It must be very uncomfortable. Now, I got a little business advice for you, Mr. Real Estate Man.
Yeah, go on.
What you have to do is you have to start dealing in Mallorca. And the reason for that is the newest, hottest show on television, at least in the New York City area, is something called the Mallorca Files. It's about a
Yeah.
man and a woman detective who solve crimes in Mallorca. And whoever's handling the cinematography of it is doing a masterful job, because everybody who sees the show is saying, well, when all this ends, we're going to Mallorca on a trip. My wife
Well,
and I are all set, packed, and ready to go. So I don't know if you're getting the show over there, but it's called the Mallorca Files, and they
I
didn't pay
must.
me to say it.
Yeah, I must have a look at that. Remember, we have a much better show called the Bromley Estate Files. So if you can give out that name, Bromley Estate, I'll say it again, seeing that you gave Mrs.
Well,
Gabby's
no, that's
Kitchen a
what.
bit of a plug.
Listen, when I get back to the cab and we're all discussing the Mallorca Files, I'll
Yeah,
say, listen, why do you want to go to Mallorca? Go to Costa del Sol.
exactly. And get in touch with Bromley Estate with me. Now, you're in lockdown at the moment, and you're quite an active man. How many hours would you have been spending per day driving your yellow cab?
Usually it's a 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. or a 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. It's a 12-hour shift. You don't drive for the whole 12 hours. You drive usually about 8 or 9. You diddle around, you see the city, you look at it. And it really always helps me too, because I myself run a wonderful website, Gabby.com.
You do. Excellent site.
And I put stories about New York and pictures about New York. So uh, it's fun for me to do it. I enjoy it. You don't become a New York City cab driver unless you like it. If you don't like it, it's the longest day of your life.
Well, I believe, and in my little bit of research, and I'd like to do a little research on you, that your show was going out to over 300 million people, and you had reached, over 300 million people in 71 countries. I want to know this. Was I the instigator of all this? Was I
No,
the
but you
man
were
who
one of the
found you?
originals. I'm
I
pretty
think I
sure the
was the
first.
original.
Yeah, you were. You probably first time you called me was probably maybe 25 or 30 years ago.
Was. It must have been. It must have been when I was 30 years ago. It would have made me nearly 15.
And you had a unique resume because of the fact that where you come from and your slight foreign accent being in Spain. What a combination.
What a combination. Yeah. I remember, I must relate a story, my story of Gabby. We've got plenty of them, but one of them was that Gabby would pick up my calls when he was driving, meaning that he had a fare in the car and he would chat to me, and then he would often hand the phone back to the passenger and say, hey, say hello to Maurice in Marbella. And so one day this happened, and she sounded like someone like Chinese or something. She go, hello. And I said, hello, and what do you think? Anyway, I could picture it. I think that she was
Well,
very
Maurice, I
scared.
have to make a confession. I can't
Yeah.
go to my grave having lied to you. I
Oh,
remember that incident quite well,
you
but it
go on. You're
wasn't
getting your
really.
way out of it now because you
No,
forgot
no,
her.
no. I'm going to tell you and your audience for the first time ever. They're going to
Okay.
hear the truth of what that was. That wasn't a passenger in the cab. That was my wife.
Really?
And to make this an extra special treat for you and your listeners, here she is.
Hey, Mrs. Gabby.
Hello.
Well, we're speaking to you again, and he can't lose you today. So, how are you? You are a gluten-free kitchen.
Yes, and also lactose free.
Oh,
I'm one
wow.
of those unhappy. Well, I used to be unhappy when it first started. I've been lactose free for almost 40 years, and I've been gluten free for 12 years,
How does
15
that make?
years.
Is that because I'm free of nothing, and at the moment I'm too free of chocolate? But tell me, does that make you? Were you forced into being that? Was there some illness that you had?
Yes, if I have anything that has lactose in it, I will have a horrible headache and throw up and keep doing that for like
So
24 hours.
give us
So
an
no milk,
example.
thank
Give
you.
us an example. What's lactose? What's it in?
Well,
What's other
anything like if I
ordinary
had,
common foods?
okay, like if I had put cream in my tomato sauce to make it creamy,
Yeah.
I instead use uh, something like coconut milk or yogurt or something of that sort. That'd be
Okay.
fine for me. So as far as cheeses and stuff go, after all these years, I'm now finally able to have something like mozzarella or hard cheeses, but I can't have anything like brie or anything like that. Would kill me. Camembert.
Would it
just make
react
me so
quickly on
sick.
you, or would it be an
Hmm?
instant thing, or would it be during the day a little later that it would start to say, "Oh
Mm,
my goodness, I had some of that, my mistake."
yeah, it starts. Let's say if we go to a restaurant and have some of that's in there, by the time we get home, 10, 15 minutes later, I'll be already starting to feel that. Yeah.
Oh, that's awful. So, what's it like being married to a Gabby the Cabby? Do you worry about, you think of the crime on the streets. Do you ever worry when that young man Peter's out there in his little cab? You worried about him that he'd be held up or something?
Yes, I do very much so. And especially when he would drive at night, it would drive me nuts.
Really?
But he's been lucky with that. So the only one time I know he got held up was in a supermarket, but he wasn't held up. He was the cashier he was giving the money to was held up.
So,
So
so how much money did he get away with then?
I don't know. You'll have to ask Peter.
Oh, man,
This.
Peter, was it Peter that was holding up the cashier? Listen, it's lovely to
Oh
speak
no,
to you,
Peter
Mrs.
wasn't. Peter
I know,
paid the
I know, I know.
cashier. He
Okay.
bent down to put something in the bag. And when he stood up, he looked at this, he says, the largest gun he's ever seen, sticking right in his,
Oh my goodness gracious me.
not at him, but at the cashier, but he was standing right there.
New York,
So,
New York.
yeah,
Tell
here
me.
he is.
Okay, thank you. It's so lovely to speak to you, Mrs. Gabby. Thank you
I
very
gotta be,
much.
I gotta be careful, or I'm gonna lose my
She
job.
sounds,
And by the
she's
way, in
lovely.
reference
She
to
sounds
your
lovely.
remark about sounding Chinese, Lalina, that's Lalina.
Uh-huh.
Lalina comes from Sri Lanka.
Okay. Well, she
She's a
sounded
practicing.
Chinese.
Well, it's that South Asian accent, I
Sure.
guess.
Yeah.
But she's getting rid of it. But she's
So
a
I,
real New
I,
York
I
person.
take it,
I'm
listening
not
to.
getting rid of it. This is me.
Listen, I take it that you're well fed there, Peter. She sounds like a great woman and a
Absolutely,
great cook. Um,
absolutely.
you don't contribute, I'm sure, except peeling the potatoes maybe
I
once
do
in a while.
washing of the dishes.
Good man, good man. So, Peter, you had a book out, or
No, I've written a book, a couple
you've
of
written a
books.
book, and you're certainly a character. You're going to write another book. You should probably follow up. You got plenty of time in your hands now. I love when people phone me up and say to me, Maurice, can we do an interview or something? And I say, yeah, okay, we can do one. What day suits you, or what time suits you? And I'll always say, hold on a minute, I'll just check my diary. And I would say, well, anytime. I'm not going anywhere. And when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I've got to sort of work out is what day it is, because every
That's
day
right.
feels like a Sunday, which is really odd.
That's odd.
Yeah,
We're living now in a weird world. So to
very
sum
good.
up, if anybody's interested in knowing anything about the Franklins, you can look at Gabby.com, which is my website. You can look at Mrs. Gabby's Kitchen, which is her website. And also on my website, I have podcasts and I have books and all kinds of stuff about New York.
He keeps himself busy. Look, it's great to have you on the line, Gabby, and we're going to keep in touch
Let's do it
more
more
often.
often.
We don't have to wait 10 or whatever years between each one of our interviews. We'll do it more often. But let's hope next time I speak to you that you will be back on the road again.
You got it, sweetheart.
Who's that?
Don't
Willie
be a
Nelson.
stranger.
Okay. Gabby
Take
the
care.
Cabby,
Bye-bye.
better known as Peter Franklin. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.